So, something very unexpected happened after the last Meta Runner theory. Down in the comments section, someone quite unusual replied to us. We had to make sure we weren't tripping, but incredibly, someone from Glitch, that's currently working on Meta Runner right now, replied to our theory, and if that wasn't cool enough, they geeked out with us as my collaborator and fellow theorist Jako had quite the conversation with them in the comments, discussing our theory and its potential impact on the series' lore. While they obviously didn't drop any spoilers, they did raise important questions that deserve addressing, and that conversation with Jako inspired so much new theorizing that they suggested we take all of it and put it into another video. So, why not? Today, I'm back with Jako as we return to dive deeper into our previous theory and its massive potential consequences for the Meta Runner lore.
Thanks again for having me back on. But before we jump back in, I'd like to give a quick disclaimer. Please, do not disturb this Glitch employee. He is very busy right now making Meta Runner awesome, and won't be spoiling the story for anyone anytime soon. Nevertheless, we're grateful that he took the time to respond to us and gave us his permission to feature our conversation with him in this video. So a big shout out to a real one, the lead art director for Meta Runner, a Mr. Matthew Peckham. Also, if you haven't watched our previous Meta Runner theory, make sure to do that first for a full understanding so you don't get lost, as this is a follow-up that'll dive much deeper into the intricate details connecting everything together. We promise it's worth the watch. The link's in the description below, and in the card at the top right-hand corner of the screen. And with that all out of the way, let's take the deep dive back into the lore.
Make sure to like and subscribe. Enjoyed the video. So Mr. Peckham had given us a lot to think about these last few days, with lots of questions about how our theory would impact various aspects of the story and underlying lore. But one thing that was pervasive across all of them was a persuasive counter-argument that, unlike our theory of Tari's bodies originating as a quite unlucky Meta Runner's corpse, he suggested that the body's origins might be fully artificial, perhaps as a lab-grown specimen. Well, one particular moment he cites to initiate this counter-argument comes from Season 2, Episode 10, where Lux made a particular point to describe Tari's bodies as artificial, where revealing his own theory on why Lucinia won't wake up from her present coma, quote, an artificial body housing the most advanced AI the whole world has ever seen.
That moment was brought up by several people when I was initially writing the theory, with them expressing concern that his choice of using the word artificial implies that Tari isn't human at all, and is instead some kind of robot. This is debunked by several details throughout the series, confirming that Tari's body has things like real blood, a pulse, a biological brain, and so on, which a robot wouldn't have. What Lux would likely be referring to align with the theory, are the many cybernetic modifications to Tari's body that Sheridan would have added to keep her alive. She could be more machine than human by this point, but Tari undeniably has a flesh and blood aspect that robots cannot, and would imply the experiments done on her body were even more inhumane than previously thought. But even if Lux wasn't referencing this technological aspect at all, there aren't many words to express exactly what he's even talking about. When an AI somehow acquires a physical body that it never had to begin with, nor could it create on its own, the word artificial seems like the best way to describe what Lux is seeing, regardless of the actual origins of the body. After all, such an occurrence is nowhere near natural, which artificial is a perfectly valid and vague enough term to describe the body's nature while keeping our theory valid in this context.
The next point brought up is more of an ambiguity on our part than a question, but is worth clarifying anyway. We mentioned in the original theory that there was presence of real blood from Tari's waking moments in the first episode's back alley lab, but for many, it might be a blink and you miss it moment if you're not specifically focusing on what to look for. In Season 1, Episode 1, when Tari wakes up in said lab, she notices an IV stuck in her arm and rips it out as she gets up from her cot. Cross-comparing the shots, we can see that said IV is connected to a bag of fluid hanging from a medical IV pole, and we even get a close-up look at that hanging bag filled with blood, confirming that she was receiving a blood transfusion at the time she woke up. As for the other monitorable vitals we mentioned, they appear on numerous computer readings from throughout the series outside the initial lab. For example, the monitoring done by Task Corp of Tari confirming Tari's blood type is AB, and that she has a working pulse, indicating the presence of a biological heart.
Mr. Peckham also makes a point about the theory from an outside perspective, specifically elaborating on how writing in such a twist may not be suitable due to having to introduce a whole new character that Tari is piloting, with not many episodes in the series left to do so. As for this potential problem of introducing such a vessel character so late in the game, I personally wouldn't see it as an issue if handled correctly. The way we'd imagine such a twist would play out would start with MD5 gaining more knowledge about Marco's underground ring, as they work side by side with him to get Tari and their friends back from Sheridan. which would gradually reveal hints about Tari's body's origins through context clues and foreshadowing from other characters, until a critical story event makes Marco realize that the body Tari has and the one he almost threw into a dumpster are one and the same, to which he finally reveals the truth about his part in Tari's vessel's death so many years ago that would finally come back to haunt him.
Contrary to being a cheat to the audience, such a revelation could be quite rewarding, as an organic yet unique way to integrate Marco into the greater backstory of the series beyond just being a one-time obstacle. If anything, the fact he returned for Season 3 via the cliffhanger ending of Season 2 would cement that he has much more of importance to the story that meets the eye. So such a plot twist of him being involved in Tari's body's death would tie him together nicely with the overarching narrative. From here on out, the questions get more complex, as do the answers, going deeper and deeper into the series' mysteries from the theory's lens. Up to this point in the conversation with Mr. Peckham and Jako, the evidence thrown around, while plausible, didn't tip the scales enough either way to put one theory over the other as more likely to be true. Jako's answer to this next question, though, regarding whether Sheridan is even capable of creating a synthetic body from scratch or not, takes a significantly different approach, deconstructing Sheridan's character journey to prove that even if he could grow a synthetic body, irrespective of his actual ability, he wouldn't want to, thanks to a seemingly inherent contradiction to his motivations to decommission Tari.
Sheridan, for as deranged and psychotic as he is, still believes he's legitimately doing the right thing through his actions. All the chaos he started, from repurposing Tari to take down Task Corp to making Masa shoot Lux dead on live TV, to him were all morally justified actions to make the world a better place. This is clearly evident by his reactions to things like Masa and Bell refusing to join his team, even though to him, he saved them from prison and put them into a world that he basically considers paradise on Earth. He legitimately believes they're being ungrateful just like everyone else that apparently can't comprehend his vision. In a way, he's less evil and more so extremely misguided in his actions, making him a significantly morally gray villain that legitimately believes all the chaos and suffering he causes is justified in service of the greater good, unaware of the larger consequences of those actions by his tunnel vision on seeing his goals through, incited by the life-changing incident that serves as his character's tipping point, the horrible lab accident that forced him into hiding.
We already know that Lux never respected Sheridan's vision for what he considered his life's work, as Sheridan's Project Blue dev logs heavily imply that Lux thought his experimental research to be such a waste of time that Sheridan was on the verge of being fired and was desperate to keep his job. Fueled by the stress that such an ultimatum would bring, Sheridan put his development cycle into speedrun mode, in the process of skipping over details that would snowball into a critical error that caused the lab explosion and Lucinia's coma. Sheridan very likely blames Lux for that accident, believing that if the Task Corp CEO had more faith in his vision, then he would have never had to rush his experiment and the accident would have never happened. That is why Sheridan goes after Lux, not just because his research was ruined or that it forced him into hiding, but because of Lux, Sheridan was pressured into carelessness and in the process hurt innocent people with the magnum opus of his scientific career.
If Sheridan was really only in it to spite Lux over a ruined lifetime of research, then he would have no reason to revive Lucinia as his current mission. Since he owns the keys to effectively do whatever he wants with Lux out of the picture, why would Sheridan care to revive his original test subject? Because he truly cares for her and feels great guilt over his sloppiness caused by Lux that put her in such major harm's way. And how does this relate to Tari? Because like Lucinia, Sheridan believes Tari is another unwitting victim of Lux that he's trying to fix, not to destroy. Again, from his devlogs and his interactions throughout Season 3 so far, Sheridan also legitimately cares for his AI Tari. After all, it's his self-proclaimed life's work, a lifelong labor of love that he nurtured almost like a daughter. For him to grow so cold to his greatest creation that he would willingly destroy it completely contradicts his characterization established up to now, which to me hints at a greater reasoning for Tari's decommissioning, that Sheridan doesn't believe the body is actually part of his beloved AI.
In the process of decommissioning Tari to return her brain functions that she doesn't need back to Lucinia, he will be reverting Tari back to her pre-accident state, the original state he knew and loved. To him, giving Tari the body was simply a tool to salvage a seemingly impossible situation, that Lucinia's consciousness was fragmented into Tari, and he had no way of separating them because the rest of Lucinia was trapped in Task Corp, which he couldn't access. The only way he could get in without getting caught by Lux Lux was to send someone on his behalf to infiltrate Lux's ranks and break it open from the inside, destroying Lux and his whole company, allowing Sheridan to enter Task Corp unopposed. And the only one he had that could even have the slightest chance to pull it off was Tari, forcing him to send her out into the world as an envoy if he was to have any chance of saving Lucinia, reluctantly risking his life's work to save another. If he really was growing a test tube Metarunner to become Tari's body, then he would likely be significantly more attached to said body than Tari's inhabits. After all, literally creating new life would stand as a whole achievement on its own, even surpassing Project Blue as his magnum opus. In addition, to put a whole new life into his plan to take down Task Corp when he's already apprehensive, risking Tari would be placing even more innocents in harm's way, just like Lux, who he hates for making him do exactly that. So if he doesn't care for the body, then that must mean it's expendable, just a means to an end of reverting everything back to a pre-accident normal. Reanimating a corpse that was already expended anyway fits this bill much better, as he would have no qualms whatsoever of destroying the corpse once it isn't needed anymore, because it wasn't alive to begin with. It wasn't an innocent person to put in harm's way because the damage was already done, and had no mind to shape or life to lead, because all those had left the corpse by the time he discovered Marco and his goons throwing it into a dumpster.
And to him, reanimating the dead, while nothing to scoff at, would likely be much less of an achievement than creating entirely new life, simply because to him, it would just be an implementation of his already established skill set on a grander scale. Instead of the body controlling the cybernetics like in most meta-runners, the cybernetics would control the body. And this technology could have been foreshadowed even as far back as Season 2, Episode 3, possibly being the origins of the Metabug, a pervasive cheating device used to control meta-runners remotely for sabotage, which Sheridan uses in his plan to end Lux, and that he likely created based on the tech for resurrecting Tari's body, to anonymously sell on the black market as his main source of income while in hiding. Therefore, by the explained structuring of his motivations and his reluctant outlook towards placing innocents in harm's way, Sheridan wouldn't have the investment to keep the body around, explaining why he's decommissioning Tari in the first place. He's not. Sheridan is just decommissioning the tools he gave to his AI Tari that it doesn't need anymore with this mission complete, and giving back her borrowed components to Lucinia, the one who ultimately needs them to be restored to her pre-accident state.
Though this explains Sheridan's motivations to use a corpse versus growing an artificial body, there's still one major thing our theory doesn't cover. Mr. Peckham made the effort specifically to mention that in the trailer for Season 3, Tari can be heard saying "we both can't come back," referring to her and Lucinia. When it was revealed that Tari absorbed part of Lucinia's consciousness during the lab accident, there's been the conflict hanging over the scenes that Tari would have to give up that part of Lucinia for her to be revived, at the expense that Tari as we know her would cease to exist. But if Tari at the end of the day is just a digital AI placed into a body regardless of the body's origins, then why can't she just be copied and that copy's data be sacrificed to revive Lucinia instead?
This was honestly the most difficult question to answer out of them all, and had me stumped for a good while. But after what can only be described as an epiphany, I finally figured out an interpretation that would solve this seeming paradox and cement our theory as the more plausible. But before we continue, we need to fully understand what this question means. What exactly does it mean to make a copy? In computer science, when data is duplicated, there are two general ways that this can occur, both of which start off with a computer reading the source data, then placing it into a separate storage medium as its destination. What separates the different types of duplication is what happens to the original source data. What is generally considered a copy operation is what happens when the original source is left intact, resulting in, unsurprisingly, two identical instances of that same data, each in different locations. This is important because there's a just as ubiquitous but easily confused operation called a cut, in which the original data, the source that is copied over to the new location, is destroyed in the process, resulting in only one instance of data at the end, effectively just moving the source from one place to another.
For Tari's statement to hold true, then that must mean copy operations must be impossible to perform, and the only way to revive Lucinia is if the data is cut out of Tari, which appears to be what's happening based on the first episodes of Season 3, but why would copies be impossible to perform in the first place? If the mechanism for both is so similar, and the only difference is what happens to the source when the operation completes, then that must mean both are possible. You can't block one without blocking the other. An arbitrary lock on only one operation isn't logically inconsistent with the mechanisms at play, so there must be some sort of outside factor prohibiting the ability to copy from Tari's mind. Perhaps, though, that mystery factor preventing her from being saved is herself.
Imagine with me, again, for a moment. In the process of testing his Metarunner's reclaimed body for finally housing his AI Tari, Sheridan does a dry run with a small testing program to assess the corpse before its maiden voyage. The beta test is promising, with all bodily systems seemingly stable and ready for the final AI payload. But when Sheridan conducts his final test to evaluate the critical last step of transferring Lucinia's consciousness when the time comes, he discovers a fatal flaw in his resurrection's design. The part of Tari's brain that stored the testing program corrupts during the copy, resulting in that part of her brain disrupting and becoming permanently unusable. Sheridan discovers the hard way that the corpse's brain is extremely fragile and only has a small amount of reads and writes remaining from its previous lifetime of use before it breaks down and permanently fails. Tari's brain, the vessel to hold his beloved AI and Lucinia's precious consciousness, has an expiration date. As a result of this, Sheridan scrambles to restructure to make sure he can complete his plan before his envoy's vessel's mind gives out and Tari and Lucinia are lost forever. A scheme that would originally take years of planning is condensed into mere months, and the variables that are MD5, Tari's unexpected detour, and her subsequent capture make the intricate planning required to work around Tari's rapidly shrinking lifespan all the more insanity-inducing. The right place at the right time becomes the only place and time he can spare, as the intricacies of every detail behind the scenes is painstakingly planned down to the minute, months in advance, with MD5's meddling forcing Sheridan meticulously reevaluate his plan at every turn, even midway during critical events, to ensure everything still fit within Tari's ticking death clock. And so it happened. After years of planning and insanity, Sheridan's plan succeeded, albeit not as exactly anticipated, but that didn't matter. With what little time there's left to spare, the Doctor now needs to complete his final step, and hope that his painstaking planning over the last 2 years has been enough to save Tari and Lucinia's mind within her. His dying Metarunner.
A race against time as his Metarunner's mind slowly dies inside her own body, with the act of copying causing her already fragile brain so much stress it permanently deteriorates. Now that be quite the twist, wouldn't it? While this would viably explain why transfers but not copies can be performed, the astute of you should be pointing out an important detail in Season 3 Episode 4 where Tari cuts Lucinia and in the process regains some of her data back that allows her Metarunner vision to start operating again. If Tari's brain deteriorates with every cut, then how could she get this data back? Simply put, her brain hasn't been used up yet. While her brain may be fragile and stuck on a death clock, that doesn't mean its capacity hasn't been fully used up. Giving her brain is that of a person in her young 20s, her brain definitely has enough room to relearn and store back the information it's lost. Even if the areas in it that originally stored said data was destroyed, the newly restored data would still be as fragile as before, prone to destruction by cutting, but as long as Tari has enough brain space, she and Lucinia's data can be cut back and forth as Tari's death clock ticks down. And with that comes the final push over the edge that makes our corpse theory all the more plausible compared to the one of an artificial body. For the reason tying all these theory elements together, Sheridan's resentment of being forced to rush and in the process take innocent lives. Throughout the series, it's heavily implied that Tari is Sheridan's one shot at saving Lucinia that he painstakingly watched and guided from the shadows. If Tari were to fail, he would have no other option to save Lucinia, and she would be forever lost. For the competing possibility that Sheridan created an artificial body for Tari, this wouldn't make sense because if Sheridan had the resources to create new life, he would spend as much time as possible to ensure perfect functionality, as any flaw would be a way for his creation to fail and for Lux to ultimately win.
Even if it took many more years to perfect the body, if he had the ability to create human life, then he could just as easily restart the process until Tari's body would be ready for its purpose. But if the stated reason that copies are impossible is true, then that would mean Sheridan intentionally looked over a major flaw in his creation to rush his Metarunner out the door, which goes against his entire characterization and throws his entire mission to revive Lucinia into jeopardy. The only way Sheridan would let such a massive flaw slide would be if he had no other choice. which would only happen if he had just one body to expend, and without the ability to create new life, that body would have to come from somewhere else. The body, the corpse, of another Metarunner. This is the smoking gun that twists this theory's implications into an all-too-possible tragedy, creating what might be the greatest narrative twist to unfold in Metarunner's history. Whether we're dead right or dead wrong, we don't have long to find out, and with that, the fate of the Metarunners, those poor souls, hanging in the balance.
Thanks for watching, and thanks to Jako for this theory, and Mr. Peckham for taking the time to respond.